ordination after the anniversary of what am I trying to say? A seminar, a college student that had been there for the summer, filled in for the summer, and he was ordained that night, and Dr. Preble assisted with the ordination too. And there was C.C. Whittemore, who was there in the 1865 to, I can't remember what, a few years, probably afternoons. I don't know what he was doing at that time, but then he had another interim in the 1880s, and he filled in there quite a bit. On Fred Preble, one thing that kind of caught my eye was that he married Gladys Chadbourne and Chester White. Gladys Chadbourne White was the organist there for 60 years. But she started in 1909 and she was married in the teens, and I wonder if she must not have played her own wedding. What it was. And I also found out, which I had, well, of course I copied this from Zion's Advocate, a Baptist paper from about 100 years, from the early 1800s to the early 1900s, that Fred Preble was appointed professor at Cobb Divinity School at Bates College. And I can't remember what he was professor of, but he was apparently a very smart man and very well liked, and he was there for, I think, 18 years. That was his last pastorate. And then there's Reverend Nathaniel French, and he was a pastor in churches in Maine, and but he was a Court Street, brought up in the Court Street Baptist, and he helped out a lot at East Auburn. The way the property came to the church, it was given by Deacon Briggs with strings attached. If there was no Baptist pastor in occupying the parsonage for a period of 5 years, the church and the parsonage would go back to the Riggs heirs. So Deacon French used to go and fill in at the church and stay sometimes at the parsonage, and that kept it in the church's name. And then we had a lady pastor, Mrs. Charles McDonald. They left in the 20s, they were there in the 20s, right through the 20s, I think. I think his first name doesn't matter. He was preaching at Court Street, and she went up to East Auburn in the afternoon and preached. And she was preaching through the time that Reverend T. Eunice Ham was ill, and got back on his feet and started to preach again, and suddenly taken ill again and died. She preached quite a bit at that time. And one person that remembered her preaching, she's no longer living, but said that she was very, very emotional, and she'd get wound up in something, and the teenage girls, which this lady that told me this, called her the sob sister. So I guess that's about it. A lot more could be, but you're lucky I left my notes in.
Okay, thank you, Nora, for filling us in on that. Okay. Well, now we'll go through fairly quickly. Here's a children's choir in the early 1950s, quite a large number. Another youth activity was the basketball team. The YMCA sponsored teams at each of the churches in the Twin Cities, and they had tournaments and played games. So each church had their own team. Here is organist Gladys Chadbourne White that Norm mentioned, and as he said, this is at her 50th anniversary. She went on to 60 years, and Norm is trying to beat that record.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
One of the most embarrassing things I ever had in my life, East Auburn started having their baptisms at Court Street. And I was practicing because the pastor we had at East Auburn wanted the organ used, and I had to go before Gladys White to see if I was qualified, or whatever you want to call it. So I bumbled my way through it, but I didn't get more than one line of a hymn. And she said, that's fine, and she apologized all over the place. Well, one time I went down to practice, and it had been a while. There was another baptism coming, and I couldn't find out how to start to turn on the organ. And this was not one of my favorite pastors, but I've been told that he was a lot of fun and good, but it was Ellis Holt. To me, he was very stern. And as I was playing, I'd try one stop, maybe a couple of measures, and try another stop and so forth. He came in the main entrance in the back of the sanctuary, and he hollered up, "Sir, you are broadcasting from the tower of this church." That would have gone under the rug. And the lady that lived across the street in the apartment house there was our old neighbor in East Auburn. She called me that night. She said that was beautiful.
Okay, so the neighbors approved. Okay. Many of you may remember Reverend Charles Bray, 1968 to 1980. Salt of the Earth Youth Ensemble was during that time. And you may or may not know Dale and Debbie Perkins, still in the area in Monmouth, I believe. Now let's test whether I can do this. There. Okay. The church constructed an education wing. So this is at the rear of the church. They constructed an education wing that goes out to Pleasant Street, and in 1959-60 and 1965-66. Now this parking lot is the site of the county jail, new county jail, and the parking has been a problem ever since, although we have at least a temporary solution, but parking has been an issue. The steeple with, okay, yeah. Okay, I talked about those. Oh, we're going backwards. Okay, the steeple was painted white in 1968. Previous to that, it had been kind of a brown. Note this building to the side. Here's the county building. Note this building to the side. This was left to the church by Samuel Hersey in 1913, and it was rented to dentists and beauty parlor and apartments, sometimes on the third floor. But it was demolished in 1976 and created a few parking spaces close by to the church entrance there. Reverend Robert Walden, 1980 to 1998. Here's the sanctuary in the 1980s. It's quite changed. Note the chancel is much broader. The choir is much higher, so that a baptistry could be placed underneath the choir. Apartments sometimes on the third floor.